A man found a battered cardboard box outside an old library on a snowy morning. Inside, something was trembling, something that should not have been left behind. There was no name, no number, only a tear-stained note with 3 haunting words. What he discovered next would change not just one life, but many. Stay with us to see how a small act of kindness unlocked a miracle no one expected. Through the winter. Waiting. Winter had pressed its silence across the town like a heavy quilt, muffling the streets in white. Willow Creek, once full of footsteps and laughter, now held its breath beneath drifting snow. It was the kind of morning where nothing moved, not the trees, not the sky, not even time. But sometimes, in the stillness, something calls to be found. And that morning, on a forgotten sidewalk outside the library, something waited. Not loud, not broken, just small and left behind. Winter had woven itself into every corner of Willow Creek, Montana, a town so small you could walk it from end to end in less than an hour, but large enough for secrets to hide under the heavy quilt of snow. The air that morning was knife-sharp, cold enough to crack the surface of puddles into jagged crystal. The sky hung low and sullen, a pewter ceiling pressing down on the earth. Jack Peterson pulled his coat tighter around his wiry frame as he stepped onto the porch of the old Willow Creek Libraria, modest red brick building that had been closed for almost a year now, but still served as a quiet retreat for a man like him. Jack was 65, with wind-chapped skin and silver hair that looked like the first dusting of snow on a pine branch. His eyes, the color of worn denim, held the soft but stubborn resilience of someone who had weathered too many seasons alone. Years of working as a librarian had given Jack a peculiar grace, a way of moving through the world as if trying not to disturb it too much. It was then, amid the hush of a world blanketed in white, that Jack noticed the box. It sat near the library steps, half sunken into a drift of snow, its cardboard edges darkened by wetness. It was the kind of box you might ship books in, or pack away memories you weren't ready to sort through. At first, Jack thought it was just trash left behind, another casualty of the storm. But then the box moved ever so slightly, a tremble more felt than seen. Jack frowned and took careful steps forward, the snow crunching under his boots loud in the otherwise breathless morning. Kneeling beside the box, he saw him. A puppy, barely 6 months old by Jack's guess, with fur the soft color of wheat fields in late summer. His small body shivered so violently that the thin layer of newspaper lining the box rustled like dry leaves. Big, solemn eyes stared up at Jack, eyes too heavy with sadness for something so young. The puppy was a Labrador retriever, though malnourishment had made him look smaller, his ribs faintly visible beneath the matted coat. Jack's heart, that stubborn organ he had long ago armored against hurt, cracked a little at the edges. Tucked beside the puppy was a folded scrap of lined paper, its corners damp. Jack carefully pulled it free and squinted at the uneven, shaky handwriting. "His name is Milo. Please love him. I'm sorry." No address, no name, only regret, raw and pleading. Jack stood there for a long moment, the wind tugging at his coat, the cold gnawing through his boots. He wasn't ready for this. He hadn't been ready for anything since the day Helen, his wife of 35 years, had passed away quietly in her sleep 2 winters ago. Since then, Jack had lived in a sort of slow hibernation, tending to memories rather than making new ones. But Milo didn't know any of that. Milo only knew that he was cold and alone. Jack exhaled a breath that misted in the frigid air, bent down, and lifted the box with gentle hands. Milo made a small, pitiful sound, half whimper, half sigh, but did not resist. Jack cradled the box close to his chest, feeling the tremors shudder through the thin walls of cardboard, and made his way back inside. The library still smelled faintly of old paper and pine cleaner, a scent Jack found more comforting than any he could name. He set the box down by the radiator, which clicked and hummed to life after he gave it a good thump with his fist. Milo peered out cautiously but did not move from the safety of his makeshift den. Jack pulled off his gloves and jacket, set a kettle on the old iron stove in the back room, and scrounged for something that resembled dog food. All he could find was a sleeve of saltine crackers and an ancient can of chicken noodle soup. He crushed the crackers into a bowl, added some warm broth, and slid it slowly toward the box. Milo stared at it, his body trembling not just from cold now but from uncertainty, the kind that lingers when trust has been broken too many times. Jack sat on the worn armchair by the radiator, a few feet away, and pretended to read yesterday's newspaper, giving the puppy his space. The minutes dragged out. The only sounds the ticking of an old clock on the wall and the occasional pop of the radiator pipes. Finally, cautiously, Milo crept forward, his paws stiff and splayed wide for balance. He sniffed the bowl, then took a tentative lick. Outside, snow continued to fall in heavy, lazy spirals. Willow Creek had all but disappeared under a thick white silence, the town's few cars buried, the cafe windows frosted over, the playground swings creaking like ghost ships in the wind. Jack's gaze wandered out the window, then back to the fragile life in front of him. He wondered what kind of child had penned that note, what kind of heartbreak had led to leaving Milo out here in the cold. He thought of all the children he had once read to in this very library, their faces bright with wonder, their laughter bouncing off the high ceilings. Life, it seemed, had a way of folding back onto itself. Later that day, as Jack fed Milo small spoonfuls of broth and cracker mash, a shadow crossed the frosted window. Ada Reynolds, his neighbor from across the street, peered in with concern. Ada was a woman of 58, stout with a wide, open face, framed by wild gray curls, usually stuffed under a knitted cap. She wore heavy boots and a parka far too big for her, as if she'd grown smaller inside her grief. Years ago, Ada had lost her only childest son in a hunting accident, and though she had returned to daily life, a certain part of her had remained suspended in that winter forever. Jack opened the door a crack. "Found something?" Ada asked, voice warm but cautious. "Someone," Jack corrected softly, stepping aside to let her see. Ada's gaze softened immediately when she spotted Milo curled by the heater, still wary, still so heartbreakingly small. "Poor thing," she murmured, stepping inside and wiping the snow from her boots. "What's his story?" Jack handed her the note. She read it quickly, pressing her lips together to stifle the quiver in her chin. "We can't leave him here alone," she said matter-of-factly, the way a mother speaks when she's already made up her mind. "I wasn't planning to," Jack said, surprising himself with the firmness in his own voice. As the storm howled outside and the little library hummed with the clatter of the old heater, a fragile sort of pact was formed between them. Jack, Milo, and Ada, three souls who had each lost something irreplaceable but found, perhaps, the beginning of something new tucked inside a battered cardboard box. The wind howled through Willow Creek like an old ghost, rattling window panes and pulling at the brittle branches of bare oaks that lined the streets. Inside the warmth of the abandoned library turned refuge, Jack Peterson sat quietly in his armchair, pretending to read yesterday's newspaper, though his eyes barely skimmed the words. Across the room, curled as tight as he could manage, was my loathy yellow Labrador puppy who, despite the comfort Jack had offered, remained anchored to a single spot near the radiator. The pup's gaze never wavered from the door, as if expecting it to swing open and reveal the one he had truly been waiting for. Milo refused food, unless Jack turned his back, and even then, he only nibbled in slow, mistrustful bites, his whole body taut with invisible tension. His small frame shook with a tremor that seemed born not from the cold anymore, but from the uncertainty rooted deep inside him. Jack, in all his patience worn smooth by years of shelving dusty books and raising a family that had since scattered to distant places, knew better than to push. Healing was a thing that had to be invited, not forced. Ada Reynolds, who had come over nearly every day since that first morning, stood by the window with her arms folded, watching the snow whip in furious gusts outside. Ada's face, with its broad nose and stubborn chin, carried the softness of someone who had loved deeply and lost just as deeply. Her voice was a low murmur when she finally spoke. "He's still waiting," she said, more to herself than to Jack. "Still waiting for someone who isn't coming back." Jack didn't respond immediately. His gaze was locked on Milo, watching the way the pup's eyes flickered at every groan of the old building, every sigh of the storm. Eventually, he said, "Some things take longer than others to understand. And some things you never really do. Ada sat down heavily on the second-hand sofa across from Jack. She pulled off her thick wool gloves, revealing hands roughened by years of hard work and colder winters. Ada wasn't a woman of many words, but her silence often said more than most people's chatter. After a long, quiet moment, she began, "You know, I had a boy once. Ethan. Red hair. Green eyes. Wild as a hawk and just as stubborn." Her voice cracked slightly, but she pressed on. "Lost him to a hunting accident 6 winters ago. He was only 19. Some mornings, I still listen for the door to open, thinking he'll come clattering in, laughing about getting the truck stuck in the ditch again." Jack looked up, his expression unreadable but not unkind. He had heard the story before, whispered through town gossip, but Ada had never spoken of it directly until now. "Milo's doing the same thing," Ada said, her voice breaking into a whisper. "He's waiting for a door that won't open." Neither of them spoke for a long while after that. Outside, the storm thickened, blurring the world into a white oblivion. Jack rose stiffly, knees popping, and moved to the small kitchenette tucked behind the library's checkout counter. He fetched a chipped ceramic bowl and filled it with a few cubes of cheese he had found in the back of the fridge, setting it down just a little closer to Milo this time. Milo's ears twitched, but he did not move. His body remained curled tight, his nose buried in the crook of his front legs, breathing shallowly as though even the act of living was an act of defiance against despair. The next few days passed in a rhythm as delicate as glass. Jack continued to bring food, leaving it within Paws' reach and retreating to his chair. Ada would come by around noon with whatever leftovers she could scrounge, a thick stew one day, slices of ham another, though Milo touched nothing unless it was Jack who offered it, and even then only when he thought Jack wasn't watching. On the 4th morning, a new figure appeared. Harold Boone, a stocky man with a barrel chest and a laugh that used to shake the rafters of the town diner, knocked hesitantly at the library door. Harold was the town's unofficial handyman, his coveralls always dusted with sawdust or motor oil. His face was usually ruddy with the cold, but today it was drawn with concern. "Word's gotten around you've got yourself a stray," Harold said, stepping inside and stomping the snow from his boots. He carried a folded blanket under one arm and a bag of kibble under the other. Jack nodded in greeting. "Found him outside the library." Harold set down the supplies near the door. "If you need help fixing up anything for him, a proper bed maybe, or a fenced run, I'm around. No charge." Jack gave him a rare, genuine smile. Harold Boone was not a man easily touched, but he had a weakness for lost causes. It had been Harold, after all, who fixed the playground swings every spring even after the town council said the funds weren't there. "I'll let you know," Jack said, and Harold left with a brisk nod, his heavy boots crunching away into the storm. By the 5th day, Milo's trembling had lessened, though he still stayed near the radiator like a soldier guarding his last outpost. Ada visited again, this time bringing a worn-out teddy bear she'd found among her late son's things. Its once bright fur was dulled to a muted gray, but its stitched smile was intact. "I thought maybe," she said, offering it with an awkward shrug. "Something to cuddle, maybe." Jack placed the bear near Milo without ceremony. To their surprise, after several hours of stillness, Milo inched forward, sniffed it cautiously, and laid his chin atop its frayed paw. The library, for all its creaks and groans, felt warmer that night. Jack watched the small, broken-hearted pup slowly ease into slumber, his body no longer curled so tightly, his breathing deeper, steadier. Milo wasn't healed, not yet. But he wasn't falling apart anymore either. Ada stayed a little longer that evening, knitting in the corner while Jack dozed lightly. Outside, the storm lost its fury, settling into a steady, peaceful whisper. Life, like snow, sometimes had to be endured until it softened into something you could bear. The snow had stopped sometime in the night, leaving Willow Creek draped in a heavy, glittering silence. Jack Peterson shuffled through the cluttered back room of the old library, searching for anything that might give him a clue about Milo's past. The little yellow Labrador had taken to sleeping curled beside the battered teddy bear Ada Reynolds had given him, his breathing now deeper, no longer the shallow gasps of fear. Jack watched the pup for a moment, feeling an unexpected tightness in his chest, before he turned back to the task at hand. He found it tucked into a corner of the box Milo had been left in, hidden under a damp flap of cardboard. A small, worn keychain shaped like a football helmet, the paint chipped away in places. Attached was a plastic tag no bigger than a coin. Faded by cold and moisture, the letters still managed to whisper a name into Jack's hand. Evan B. It wasn't much, but in a town like Willow Creek, even a whisper could be enough to stir echoes. Jack turned the tag over in his calloused fingers, the gears in his mind slowly grinding into motion. He hadn't worked in the library for 30 years without learning a thing or two about piecing together mysteries. He grabbed his coat, slung his scarf around his neck, and after giving Milo a final, reassuring glance, stepped into the cold morning air. His first stop was the Willow Creek Post Office, a squat brick building that smelled perpetually of dust and rubber bands. Behind the counter stood Margaret Lane, a sharp-eyed woman in her late 60s, with steel-gray hair pinned into a bun so tight it looked like it might crack. Margaret had a reputation for remembering every address, every change of residence slip, and every scandal that passed through town. Jack approached the counter and cleared his throat. "Morning, Margaret." Margaret looked up from sorting letters, her eyebrows lifting slightly. "Jack Peterson. Haven't seen you out this early in a while. Library ghosts finally get too noisy?" Jack allowed himself a thin smile. "Something like that. Actually, I was wondering if you knew any kids around town named Evan. Evan with a last name starting with B." Margaret tapped a manicured nail against the counter thoughtfully. "Evan B. Let's see. Not many Evans around here. Could be Evan Brooks. Lived over on Willow Lane with his mom, last I heard. What happened to them?" Margaret's lips pursed into a thin line. "Rough business. His mom, Dana Brooks, she struggled after her husband left. Lots of rumors. Some said she took off. Others said child services stepped in. Evan was staying with an aunt for a while, but they weren't from Willow Creek originally. Came here maybe 2 years ago. Quiet kid. Kept to himself." Jack thanked her, pocketing the keychain carefully. As he turned to leave, Margaret called after him, her voice surprisingly gentle. "If you find him, be kind. That boy's had a harder road than most." Jack nodded once and stepped back into the cold. Later that afternoon, Ada Reynolds joined him for coffee in the library, having heard through the thin walls of their side-by-side houses that Jack was up to something. She wore her usual bulky coat and a scarf knitted in wild, clashing colors that her late son had once given her a memory she carried openly, like a badge rather than a wound. Jack explained what he'd found, showing her the keychain and relaying Margaret's words. Ada's brow furrowed, deep lines etching themselves deeper into her face. "I remember Dana Brooks now. Short, thin woman with nervous hands. Used to come into the diner sometimes, looked like she hadn't slept in a week. Always had Evan with her, little guy with a backpack bigger than he was." "Sounds like her boy," Jack said quietly. They sat in companionable silence for a while, sipping coffee that was more warmth than taste. Finally, Ada said, "You gonna try and find him?" Jack looked at Milo, who had ventured closer over the last few days, sometimes resting a tentative paw on the hem of Jack's jeans. The pup's eyes were no longer frantic, but they still held a question Jack couldn't yet answer. "Yeah," Jack said. "I have to." Over the next few days, Jack reached out to old connections, teachers he had known from his years hosting library reading programs, a former social worker named Elsie Crane who now ran the town's tiny food pantry. Elsie was a woman in her 50s, with a brisk way of talking and eyes that missed nothing. She wore thick glasses and dressed in layers of cardigans no matter the season, her wardrobe a living archive of handmade gifts from grateful families. When Jack explained the situation, Elsie's face softened under the weight of memory. "I remember Evan Brooks," she said, rummaging through a worn ledger. "After his mom disappeared, he bounced around a bit. Last I heard, he was placed with a family in Briar Hollow. That's 2 towns over. Not the best system, Jack. Kids get lost in it." Jack thanked her, feeling both closer and yet painfully aware of how fragile this thread was. Briar Hollow wasn't far, but in the life of a child, it could have been a lifetime away. That evening, Jack returned to the library, exhausted but filled with a new resolve. Milo greeted him at the door, tail giving a tentative thump against the floorboards. Jack crouched down and rubbed behind his ears, feeling the warmth of trust beginning to blossom. "We're getting closer, boy," he said softly. Ada dropped by after dinner, bringing an old dog bed she had dug out of her attic. She set it down by the fire, smoothing it out with the kind of tenderness reserved for small, breakable things. Milo sniffed it suspiciously at first, then, after a long pause, climbed in, curling himself into a small, contented ball. Jack watched the flicker of firelight across the room and thought about Evan Brooks, wherever he was, and about the boy who had loved this dog enough to leave him with a note instead of abandoning him entirely. A boy who had promised love, even in the face of goodbye. They were going to find him. Jack knew it as surely as he knew the winter would eventually break into spring. The roads that led out of Willow Creek were little more than ribbons of cracked asphalt, curling through snow-laden hills and empty farmlands. Jack Peterson leaned against the hood of his old Ford pickup, gloved hands cradling a travel mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. The sky was a heavy gray quilt above them, sagging low with the promise of another storm, and in the passenger seat, Milo sat patiently, his head tilted slightly as if sensing the weight of what was coming. Ada Reynolds shuffled out from her house across the street, a knitted green scarf flapping around her neck and a canvas tote bag slung over one shoulder. Ada was not built for subtlety. Her wide frame and determined gait made her presence known wherever she went, but there was a softness to her today. A lightness Jack hadn't seen since she first crossed back into his life after Ethan's passing. She opened the passenger door, ruffling Milo's ears affectionately before tossing the tote onto the floorboard. Got snacks, a thermos of soup, and some of that jerky Harold Boone swore was only a little expired. We'll survive, she said with a wink. Jack grunted a laugh, the sound rusty from disuse. Thanks, Ada. Milo wagged his tail, a slow, tentative sweep end. Jack felt that familiar swell in his chest again, the one he was almost too old and too stubborn to name. Their plan was simple enough. Drive to Briar Hollow, visit the local foster care office, and find Evan Brooks. But Jack knew better than to trust simplicity. Life, after all, rarely handed out easy endings. The drive was quiet at first, the truck's heater sputtering against the chill. Snowbanks towered on either side of the narrow highway, and the world outside blurred into a monotonous wash of white and gray. Ada filled the silence in small ways, telling stories about the town, about Harold getting his snowplow stuck sideways outside the diner, about Missy Grant, the schoolteacher who once tried to host a winter carnival that ended in a 20-car pileup of sleds and soup thermoses. Jack listened with half an ear, grateful for the noise, grateful even more for the way Milo occasionally shifted to lean his head against Jack's arm, seeking reassurance. As they neared Briar Hollow, Jack's jaw tightened. He hadn't been out this way in years, not since a distant cousin's funeral, and the place hadn't improved with time. The town was a scatter of low, tired buildings, most with peeling paint and crooked porch rails. The foster care office was housed in what used to be a small church, its steeple leaning precariously like a drunk trying to find his footing. Inside, the office smelled faintly of mildew and hand sanitizer. A slim woman in her early 30s sat behind the front desk, typing with quick, clipped movements. Her name tag read Rachel Myers. She wore a thick beige sweater and glasses perched precariously on her nose, her brown hair pulled back into a utilitarian ponytail. There was a weariness about her, the kind that clung to people who spent their lives mending what others had broken. Rachel looked up as Jack and Ada entered, offering a polite, if tight, smile. "Can I help you?" Jack cleared his throat. "We're looking for information on a boy, Evan Brooks. We think he might have come through here." Rachel's smile faltered slightly, replaced by a professional wariness. "And you are?" Jack hesitated, but Ada stepped in smoothly. "Family friends. Just trying to check on him. Got some news he might want to hear." Rachel regarded them both carefully for a moment before nodding and motioning them toward a battered couch against the wall. "Wait here." The minutes crawled by, punctuated only by the squeak of Rachel's sneakers on the worn linoleum floor. Milo sat at Jack's feet, his nose twitching as if trying to catalog the unfamiliar sense of fear, hope, and bureaucracy. When Rachel returned, she carried a thin file folder tucked under one arm. She sat on the edge of her desk, arms crossed loosely over her chest. Evan Brooks was placed with the Martin family about 6 months ago. Good people. They live out near Crescent Pines, about 15 minutes north. You'll need to set up a meeting through the proper channels, though. We can't just hand out addresses. Jack nodded, heart sinking slightly. Ada, never one to be deterred, leaned forward. We understand. But maybe you could tell Evan we're looking for him? That we have something of his? Rachel studied them again, then smiled, this time softer, less guarded. I'll make a call. Give me a number where you can be reached. Jack scribbled his cell number on a notepad she slid across the desk. Rachel promised to be in touch and ushered them out with a quick, professional wave. Back in the truck, Jack stared out over the snow-blanketed fields, feeling the weight of hope pressing down against the uncertainty. Milo laid his head on Jack's knee, warm and steady as a heartbeat. Ada unwrapped a sandwich from her tote, handing half to Jack without a word. They ate in silence, sharing food like soldiers in a long-forgotten war. On the drive back to Willow Creek, Ada talked about maybe fostering again, maybe even adopting. Not a baby, no, she said. Too old for midnight feedings, but a teenager maybe, someone who needs a home, not just a roof. Jack didn't answer immediately, but he tucked the thought away. Milo thumped his tail once against the seat, as if agreeing with the sentiment. As dusk turned the snow to silver, and the mountains cast long shadows across the highway, Jack realized that their journey wasn't just about finding Evan. It was about finding pieces of themselves they thought were lost too. The call came 2 days after they returned from Briar Hollow. Rachel Myers' voice was brisk, but not unkind over the crackling line. We've spoken to the Martins. They're willing to arrange a supervised meeting. 1 hour. No promises beyond that. Jack Peterson thanked her, his voice hoarse with gratitude. After he hung up, he sat in silence for a long moment, the library around him golden and still in the late afternoon light. Milo, sensing the shift in energy, trotted over and laid his head in Jack's lap, eyes brimming with a trust Jack still marveled at. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the snow glittering like a field of diamonds under the sharp Montana sun. Jack pulled on his best jackatan old brown corduroy thing that Helen had once patched at the elbow and brushed Milo until his coat shone like wheat under sunlight. Ada Reynolds appeared at his doorstep just as he was gathering Milo's leash, bundled in her thick parka and holding a thermos of hot chocolate. You'll need this, she said with a small knowing smile. Jack managed a tight nod. You coming? Ada hesitated, then shook her head. This is between you three now, but I'll be here when you get back. She reached down, ruffling Milo's ears gently. Good luck, little one. The drive to Crescent Pines was quieter than Jack expected. Milo sat upright in the passenger seat, tail thudding the upholstery in slow, rhythmic beats, as if he could sense the nearness of something long lost. Crescent Pines was smaller than Willow Creek, a cluster of modest houses tucked among frost-laden pines. The Martin family home sat on the end of a cul-de-sac, its white clapboards siding freshly painted, a bright red door standing out cheerfully against the snow. A woman was waiting outside, arms crossed to fight the cold. Her name was Laura Martin. She was in her early 40s, short and sturdily built, with close-cropped blonde hair and kind gray eyes. She wore jeans, snow boots, and a thick navy sweater, giving off the solid, unshakable air of someone who had spent her life weathering storms both literal and emotional. There was a tiredness about her, yes, but also a resilience that Jack immediately respected. Laura approached the truck as Jack parked, offering a hand. You must be Jack, and this must be Milo. Jack shook her hand, noticing the strength in her grip. Thank you for agreeing to this. Laura smiled, a touch wary. Evan's inside. He's been anxious since he heard. Jack clipped the leash to Milo's collar, but before he could even open the door fully, Milo squirmed out from under his hand, slipping free with a sudden, desperate energy Jack had never seen before. The pup bounded toward the porch, his paws kicking up sprays of snow. The front door swung open, and a boy burst out skinny, all elbows and knees, wrapped in a threadbare red hoodie. Evan Brooks. His hair was a wild mop of chestnut brown, and his jeans hung too loose around his thin frame. His face freckled, pale, and too serious for someone so young lit up the instant he saw Milo. Milo, the boy gasped, voice cracking under the weight of disbelief. Milo let out a sharp, joyous bark and launched himself into Evan's arms. The boy crumpled to his knees in the snow, wrapping his arms around the trembling, wriggling mass of fur that whined and whimpered and licked at every inch of his face. Jack watched, a lump forming in his throat. Laura wiped at her eyes discreetly with the edge of her sleeve. The world narrowed to the boy and his dog, clinging to each other like shipwreck survivors finally hauled ashore. After a long moment, Evan pulled back slightly, clutching Milo's face between his hands. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I tried to come back. I didn't know where they took you." Milo, as if understanding every word, pressed his nose against Evan's chest, breathing him in. Jack approached slowly, careful not to shatter the fragile bubble surrounding them. Laura followed, her steps deliberate. "We only have about an hour," she said gently, placing a hand on Evan's shoulder. The boy nodded but didn't let go of Milo, who had now half-crawled into his lap, tail thudding a frantic, joyous rhythm against the porch steps. Inside, the Martin home was warm and lived in. Toys were scattered around a small living room, a faint scent of cinnamon lingering in the air. Jack took a seat near the fireplace while Evan and Milo sprawled on the rug, talking in a quiet, fervent way only the closest companions can manage after too long apart. Laura sat across from Jack, her fingers laced together tightly in her lap. "He talked about Milo every day," she said softly. "Didn't want to get attached to anything else. I didn't know if he even believed Milo was still alive." Jack smiled faintly. Milo never stopped waiting. For the better part of an hour, Evan brushed Milo's fur, checked his paws, fed him treats Laura produced from somewhere in the kitchen. The boy's face, which had been so guarded when Jack first glimpsed him, opened up like a thawing river in spring. But the hour passed too quickly. When Laura quietly reminded Evan that Milo couldn't stay, Jack saw the panic return to the boy's eyes. "No," Evan cried, clutching Milo tighter. "Please, he's my family." Laura crouched down, placing a hand on his knee. "Sweetheart, it's not forever. We just need to make sure everything's done right. You're still settling here. There are rules." Rules. Jack hated that word just then. It always seemed to get between hearts trying to find each other. Evan's chin trembled, but he nodded. Milo whined, sensing the shift. Jack knelt beside them, voice low and steady. "You found each other again. That's what matters. We'll figure out the rest." Slowly, gently, Evan unwrapped his arms. Laura led him back inside, tears slipping down his cheeks, Milo's leash trembling in Jack's hand as he watched the boy disappear through the red door. Back in the truck, Milo curled into a tight ball in the passenger seat, head resting on Jack's thigh. The drive back to Willow Creek was longer than Jack remembered, the road unwinding under a sky the color of old tin, heavy and bruised. But despite the ache lodged deep in his chest, Jack knew something had changed today. The first bridge had been rebuilt. It might take time and patience and more red tape than any sane man could stomach, but it would happen. Hope, after all, was a stubborn thing. The deep heart of winter loosened its grip on Willow Creek in slow, reluctant measures. Snow still lined the sidewalks like stubborn memories, but the sun began its slow campaign to reclaim the town, casting long golden beams across the rooftops and stirring the frozen earth beneath. Inside the library, Jack Peterson built a new rhythm around the quiet weight of Milo's presence. Milo had shed the last of his frantic skittishness. Now, he shadowed Jack's every move like a second heartbeat, following him from room to room with patient eyes and a tail that wagged just once, deliberately, whenever Jack spoke. No longer the trembling, half-starved creature from the cardboard box, Milo had grown stronger, his frame filling out under Jack's steady hand and Ada's endless supply of donated stew meat. His coat shone like polished honey in the afternoon light, and his paws thudded confidently against the floorboards instead of slipping and scuttling like before. Jack, for his part, adapted in ways he hadn't thought possible at his age. He found himself speaking aloud more, reading old novels by the fire with Milo's chin resting on his knee. Small rituals stitched their days together: morning walks around the thawing town square, lazy afternoons in the sun-warmed library, quiet evenings tracing constellations through the frost-lined windows. Yet it was Ada Reynolds who underwent the most visible transformation. One windy afternoon, she marched up to Jack's door, cheeks flushed and hair escaping wildly from her knit cap. In one arm, she carried a chilled little girl bundled tightly in a second-hand pink coat, her small gloved hand clutching Ada's scarf with white-knuckled desperation. "This," Ada said, half breathless, "is Emma." Jack blinked, setting down his coffee cup. "You've got yourself a new roommate?" Ada chuckled, the sound a little watery at the edges. "Foster arrangement. Temporary, they say. Maybe longer. She needed somewhere to go." "And She glanced down at the child in her arms, something soft and fiercely protective flashing through her expression. "I figured my house had been quiet long enough." Emma Parker was 6 years old, with tangled brown hair, large brown eyes the color of wet bark, and a mouth that rarely spoke unless coaxed with great care. She wore sadness, like a second skin, an invisible weight that shaped her movements and hollowed her tiny shoulders. According to Ada, Emma had bounced between relatives after her parents' deaths in a car accident, each home colder and more indifferent than the last. Jack crouched slowly, mindful not to loom. "Hi there, Emma," he said in the voice he reserved for frightened animals and shy children. Emma only stared at him, fingers tightening in Ada's scarf. Milo, sensing the tremor in the air, padded forward. He approached Emma with the solemnity of a knight, offering fealty, lowering his head and extending one paw gently onto the hem of her coat. Something in the little girl shifted. She didn't smile a note yet, but her grip on Ada loosened, and she reached a tentative hand toward Milo's broad head, brushing his ears with the tips of her fingers. From that moment, Emma became a part of their fragile, growing family. The days rolled forward in slow, strengthening waves. Jack found himself setting an extra place at the library's rickety kitchen table whenever Ada and Emma visited. Ada taught Emma how to knit lopsided scarves that unraveled if you pulled the wrong thread. Jack showed her how to stack books in the ancient Dewey Decimal System, a skill she found inexplicably hilarious. And Milo became her constant, her shadow, her silent protector. On sunny days, they ventured outside. Jack and Ada would sit on the library steps, coffee mugs warming their hands, while Emma tossed sticks clumsily for Milo to chase through the slush. Laughter, cautious at first and then freer, began to lace itself through the crisp winter air. One evening, as the sky blushed purple behind the mountains and a few brave robins dared to call from the trees, Emma fell asleep on the old plaid couch in Jack's reading room. Milo curled at her feet, his body curved protectively around her small form. Ada stood in the doorway, arms crossed over her chest, watching them with a look Jack recognized all too well, a look stitched from wonder and fear in equal measure. "She doesn't have to go back," Ada said softly, almost as if confessing a prayer she wasn't sure she deserved to say aloud. Jack nodded, his heart heavier and lighter all at once. "She doesn't." Outside, the last breath of winter melted into the ground. In its place, tiny green shoots pushed stubbornly through the earth, oblivious to the memory of the cold. Inside the library, surrounded by the smell of old paper and new beginnings, Jack, Ada, Emma, and Milo stitched themselves into something not defined by blood or law, but by quieter, fiercer things, by hope, by loyalty, and by the stubborn belief that even hearts that have broken clean in two can be mended, if you are willing to try. The first true breath of spring carried a hint of warmth through Willow Creek, coaxing stubborn patches of green from beneath the stubborn frost. Jack Peterson sat at his usual spot by the library window, a mug of coffee cooling on the table beside him, a well-worn book open but forgotten in his lap. Milo dozed at his feet, one ear flickering occasionally at the sounds of the world waking up again. The call came just before noon, slicing through the quiet like a bell. Jack fumbled for his phone, squinting at the unfamiliar number before answering with a cautious, "Hello?" It was Rachel Myers from Briar Hollow's foster agency. Her voice, usually brisk and clipped, carried an unmistakable note of excitement. "Jack, I've got news. Evan Brooks has been officially adopted by a family in Willow Creek, the Carsons. They finalized everything this morning." Jack's heart gave a painful thump against his ribs. "Willow Creek? Here?" "Yes," Rachel said, chuckling at his disbelief. "Right there in town. They specifically requested to stay close to his roots." Jack scrubbed a hand over his face, feeling lighter than he had in months. "What about Milo?" Rachel hesitated, then continued. "The Carsons know about Milo. They're willing to help reunite them properly as long as we ease into it. Jack could hardly believe it. After months of cautious hope, of watching Milo gaze at the door every evening as if expecting Evan to walk through it, the pieces were finally coming together. He thanked Rachel profusely, ended the call, and knelt down, running his hand through Milo's sun-warmed fur. "You're going home, boy," he said, voice breaking just a little. "You're going home." The news spread through their little circle quickly. Ada Reynolds was the first to arrive at the library, practically bursting through the door, cheeks pink with excitement. Emma trailed behind her, clinging shyly to Ada's coat but with a tentative smile stretching her small mouth. "They're moving into Maple Hollow," Ada announced breathlessly, referring to a quiet cul-de-sac, not more than a 5-minute walk from Jack's front steps. Big blue house, with the white shutters. Jack nodded, smiling, even though his chest ached. He was happy, genuinely happy, but there was a hollow, echoing space inside him that he couldn't ignore. He had spent months stitching Milo into the empty spaces of his life, and now he would have to let him go. The Carsons arranged the meeting for a Saturday afternoon. Jack spent the morning brushing Milo until his coat shone like polished gold, and packing up his favorite Chew Toya battered rope notent, the thick flannel blanket he always slept on. At 2 o'clock sharp, Jack drove to Maple Hollow with Ada and Emma squeezed into the truck beside him. The neighborhood was idyllic. Broad streets, neat gardens just beginning to bud, children's bicycles tipped against white picket fences. The Carson house stood at the end of the street, a 2-story colonial with a wide front porch. On the steps stood Evan, looking small but radiant with anticipation. Beside him were Mark and Claire Carson, his new adoptive parents. Mark Carson was a man in his late 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-browned skin and laugh lines etched deep around his eyes. He wore a faded flannel shirt and jeans, and his hand rested protectively on Evan's shoulder. Claire was shorter, slender, with kind eyes and a voice that immediately put people at ease. Her blonde hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, and she wore simple jeans and a soft blue sweater. Jack parked at the curb and stepped out slowly, unhooking Milo's leash. But Milo needed no encouragement. The moment he spotted Evan, he tore across the grass in great bounding leaps, barking joyously. Evan dropped to his knees, arms wide, and Milo slammed into him, knocking him backward onto the lawn. The boy's laughter rang out clear, bright, and Helinga's Milo wriggled and whined and tried to crawl inside Evan's jacket out of sheer happiness. Jack stood back, hands shoved deep into his pockets, blinking against the sudden sting in his eyes. Ada and Emma stood quietly nearby, watching with smiles tugging at their faces. After a few long minutes, Evan looked up, eyes shining. "He remembers," he said simply. Mark and Claire approached, greeting Jack warmly. They explained their planned show Evan would finish out the school year at Willow Creek Elementary, how they were setting up a dog run in the backyard for Milo, how Claire had already scheduled a vet visit to get Milo fully checked out. They wanted to make it work. They wanted Milo there. Jack listened, nodding, feeling the bittersweet edges of joy and loss gnawing gently at him. When the time came to leave, Jack knelt beside Milo, who looked between him and Evan with a puzzled expression. "You're staying, buddy," Jack whispered, scratching behind Milo's ears. "This is where you belong." Milo whined softly, pressing his head against Jack's chest for a long, aching moment before turning and bounding back to Evan. Jack rose stiffly, heart heavy but whole. The drive home was quiet. Ada reached over once to squeeze his hand, and Emma dozed against her side, worn out from the emotions of the day. The library felt emptier without Milo. Jack walked through the familiar rooms, noticing every missing sound, the soft thud of paws, the rhythmic sighs of sleeping breath. But he also noticed something else. The faint scent of spring on the air, the sunlight pooling stronger through the windows, the subtle, unstoppable forward motion of life. Milo was where he was supposed to be. Evan had his boy back. And Jack had built something too. Something that didn't end just because one chapter closed. Spring in Willow Creek was a shy visitor, arriving in hesitant steps. The town square bloomed with crocuses and daffodils. The once frozen river hummed with new life, and children's laughter returned to the playgrounds as if winter had only been a bad dream. Banners of pastel colors fluttered from lampposts, announcing the annual Spring Festival, a tradition older than most of the town's oldest residents. Jack Peterson stood by the library steps, watching as the townsfolk set up booths selling homemade pies, jars of wildflower honey, and hand-knit scarves. His hands rested loosely in the pockets of his corduroy jacket, his face weathered but easy, with a contentment he hadn't felt in years. Next to him, Ada Reynolds fussed with a small table covered in second-hand books they had decided to sell for the benefit of the town's battered animal shelter. Ada, dressed in a blue floral blouse and sturdy khakis, had changed in subtle but remarkable ways. Her steps were lighter, her laughter more ready, her eyes brighter. Her once grieving heart now carried the steady, quiet joy of someone who had found purpose again through Emma, through Jack, and through this strange patchwork family they had built without quite meaning to. Emma, now less timid and much more inquisitive, darted between booths with the uncoordinated enthusiasm of a young deer. Her brown hair was pulled back into two messy braids, and she wore a purple sweatshirt with a giant smiling sun stitched across the chest. In one hand, she clutched a balloon. In the other, a sugar-dusted donut nearly as big as her face. Jack watched her with a small smile, feeling the hum of life settle into his bones. The clatter of paws on pavement drew his attention just in time to see Evan Brooks running toward them, his arms pumping, laughter bubbling from his throat. Beside him bounded Milo, his golden coat catching the sunlight like fire, his ears flopping with each joyous leap. Jack straightened just in time to catch Evan barreling into a quick, fierce hug. The boy had filled out since Jack last saw him, still lean, still wiry, but with a sturdier frame and a new confidence glowing in his face. His brown hair was sun-bleached at the tips, and he wore a navy hoodie with the Willow Creek Elementary logo across the front. Milo skidded to a halt beside them, tail wagging so hard it rocked his entire body. He pushed his nose into Jack's hand with a whine of pure happiness before bounding over to Ada and licking her hand until she laughed, scolding him half-heartedly. "You made it," Ada said, ruffling Evan's hair affectionately. "Wouldn't miss it," Evan beamed. "Mom and Dad are at the bake sale booth. They said I could have the afternoon to myself with Milo." Jack knelt down, scratching behind Milo's ears, feeling the old, familiar connection spark like a struck match. Milo leaned into him heavily, tail slowing into a gentle sweep, a look in his deep brown eyes that said, unmistakably, "You're still my family too." For the next few hours, they meandered through the festival together. Evan and Emma raced each other in sack races, Milo barking encouragement from the sidelines. Jack bought 3 raffle tickets and promptly lost every one. Ada won a blue ribbon in the pie tasting contest, much to her scandalized amusement. Around mid-afternoon, they gathered at a picnic table near the town fountain. Jack sipped cold lemonade from a paper cup, while Ada shared a plate of cookies with Emma. Evan and Milo flopped in the grass nearby, the boy's hand tangled in the dog's soft fur. Across the square, Jack spotted Harold Boonstill Burley, still cheerful hammering together a new sign for the rebuilt playground. Margaret Lane waved from the post office booth, handing out flyers with a smile that looked almost genuine. Even Rachel Myers was there, helping organize a small parade of local rescue animals looking for homes. It struck Jack then, deep and sure, how life had unfolded in ways none of them could have predicted, how broken pieces, when stubbornly loved and stitched together, could form something stronger than before. As the sun began its slow descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in soft pinks and golds, Evan tugged gently at Jack's sleeve. "Hey, Jack," he said, his voice shy but certain. "Milo still misses you, you know. We were thinking, maybe you could come by sometimes? For walks? Or stories?" Jack felt the question settle into his chest like a seed in good earth. He glanced down at Milo, whose tail wagged once, a slow and certain sweep. "I'd like that," Jack said, his voice rough with emotion. Beside him, Ada slipped her hand into his, squeezing once, firmly. Emma grinned up at them, her cheeks sticky with lemonade and joy. The bell tower chimed 6 o'clock, signaling the end of the festival. But for Jack, Ada, Evan, Emma, and Milo, it wasn't an ending at all. It was another beginning, quiet, enduring one, stitched not by blood or name, but by the fierce and stubborn threads of love. As they made their way home under the first shy stars of the season, Milo ran ahead, looping back every few steps to nudge Jack's hand, to check that he was still there. Jack laughed, a sound he hadn't made freely in years, and broke into a slow jog to keep up. Family, he realized, wasn't always something you were born into. Sometimes, it was something you built stick by stick, memory by memory, trust layered over hope until it was strong enough to weather anything. And as Milo dashed between them, a golden streak of joy and belonging, Jack knew they were exactly where they were meant to be. Sometimes, the smallest acts of love create the greatest miracles. A boy who kept believing, a dog who kept waiting, a man who chose to open his heart again. In the silence of our hardest days, God is still working, weaving stories of hope, of healing, of home. Maybe your story is still being written too. If this journey touched your heart, we would love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below because every story of hope deserves to be heard.